He was only 2 years old, left alone in the freezing forest by someone who was supposed to love him. No food. No coat. Just a stuffed rabbit gripped tight in his tiny hands, and tears already frozen to his cheeks. And just when all hope seemed lost, an old golden retriever appeared. He was limping. Weathered. Listening for something. A cry. And what happened next would change both their lives forever. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. The wind rolled cold off the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, slipping like silent fingers through the bare trees and sweeping across the frozen surface of a narrow river that wound through the forest. Snow hadn't fallen heavy yet this season, but the ground sparkled under the hush of early winter, white dusting bark and stone, softening the world into stillness. In that stillness, the sound of tires cracked against gravel. Slow. Deliberate. A blue SUV crunched its way down the forgotten logging road. Rust crowned the wheel wells, and a spiderweb track laced the rear window, sealed sloppily with duct tape. It was the kind of car that carried more secrets than passengers. The SUV stopped suddenly near the river's edge, far from where hikers or locals ever came. The engine idled briefly, then sputtered off. The woman in the driver's seat, Melissa, pushed her sunglasses to the top of her head. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Her features were delicate, almost doll-like, framed by caramel blonde waves cascading over the collar of a black faux fur coat. But the tension in her jaw, the stiff, jerky movements of her hands, they told another story. She stepped out and mounted to the back seat. Then, in an oversized car seat, sat a little boy. He couldn't have been more than 2. Bundled tight in a yellow fleece snowsuit with soft bare ears on the hood. His light brown eyes were swollen red, from crying, from cold, or maybe both. He hugged a floppy, gray-stained stuffed rabbit close to his chest. When Melissa opened the door, he looked up. "Mama?" he asked, lips trembling. "No," she replied. "Not harsh. Not cruel. Just, final." With frozen breath throbbing in the air, she unbuckled him, her fingers stiff. She lifted him easily, as though his weight startled her. Gently, she placed him on the icy ground. He wobbled, unsure on his soft-soled boots. Confused. The rabbit dangled from one mitten-covered hand. She placed a wooden tote bag next to him. Inside, a half-full bottle of apple juice, a plastic bag of crackers, and a threadbare wool blanket. That was all. Melissa crouched in front of him. Brushed one curl from his forehead, but didn't meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I can't do this. I'm not who you need." Then she stood and walked away. She didn't look back. The SUV engine groaned. The wheels spun once in the frost, then taut. The boy stood silent as the red taillights slipped between the trees and disappeared. He didn't cry right away. He just stood there, like maybe this was a game. One he didn't understand yet. After a minute or two, he took a few uncertain steps toward the direction the car had gone, then stopped. The cold bit at his cheeks. He looked around. Strange trees. Silent woods. The sky heavy with cloud. Then he looked down at his rabbit. And sat. Only then did the tears come, quiet at first. Then louder. A cry that cracked and broke with every shivering breath. High and thin, rising into the forest like a flare from the heart. Miles away, under a collapsed woodshed near an old ranger station, something stirred. It was a golden retriever. Elderly. Dust-colored with age, his coat thick but mottled with white. One of his hind legs dragged slightly when you moved. The fur on his face was graying, his eyes dimmed with years and fog. His name, once, had been Bruno. Bruno had known warmth. Purpose. He'd worn a badge once, crawled beside firemen at night, run towards smoke and screaming voices. But age and injury had ended that chapter. They tried to rehome him, but no one wanted a limping dog with a cloudy eye and an old service vest. So he had wandered, faded into the forests. Until now. The sound wasn't natural. Not fox. Not fawn. Not bird or storm. It was a child. Bruno's ears lifted. His spine stiffened. Muscles long and used twitched beneath his thick coat. He turned his head toward the sound, eyes squinting through the trees. Without hesitation, he stood. And moved. Not fast. But steady. Back near the river, the boy had stopped crying, too tight. His cheeks were blotched pink from the cold, nose running freely. He had wrapped himself in the blanket the best he could and now sat beside the open tote bag, which was dusted with frost. His stuffed rabbit was tucked under his chin. His breath came shallow. Fast. The wind picked up, and he flinched. Then, a sound. Snow crunching. A shape. Big. Dark. Moving through the trees. The boy whimpered, trying to shrink back into the folds of the blanket. The stuffed rabbit dropped from his hand. But the shape slowed. A soft, low chuff, almost like a sigh, carried through the clearing. Then Bruno stepped into view. His gait was slow. Measured. His breath misted in the cold air. The boy looked up, sniffling, unsure, afraid. But something in him didn't scream. There was something about this dog. Something familiar. Bruno circled the boy slowly. He sniffed the bag. The blanket. The child's mittened hand. And then, quietly, he lay down beside him, pulling his thick frame against the boy's tiny body. The boy leaned into him, instinctively. His little fingers burrowed into Bruno's coat. A small sigh escaped his lips, and his eyelids began to fall. In the hush of the forest, the wind settled. The boy and the old dog, two lives abandoned, forgotten, curled into one another, their warmth a single heartbeat in the snow. Snow began to fall. Soft flakes landed on Bruno's back, on the rabbit now half buried beside them. The golden retriever didn't stir. He stayed pressed to the boy. Protective. Patient. But deep in the back of his mind, behind the haze of age and the pain in his joints, something stirred. A command, almost forgotten. Find help. He could give warmth. He could give safety. But he could not save the child alone. Bruno's eyes blinked open. He listened. Watched the child breathing, still fast, still cold. And somewhere deep in him, that training, that purpose, flickered back to life. He would not leave him. But they could not stay here. The boy stirred. A faint sound, a whimper, barely audible, escaped his lips as he blinked into the snowy dusk. His cheeks were raw, his nose crusted with frost. His tiny hands gripped Bruno's neck, not out of fear, but comfort. His stuffed rabbit had fallen beside them, half buried in snow. Bruno knew they had to move. He rose carefully, shifting his body so the child rolled gently from his side. The boy let out a tiny protest, like the sound of a dream interrupted, but Bruno nudged him softly with his nose. The child opened his eyes. Looked at the dog. Those big, amber eyes staring back at him with something like promise. Warmth. Assurance. A silent message that said, "Follow me." Without understanding how or why, the boy did. His mittened hand reached out and buried itself in the fur at Bruno's neck. Unsteady, his legs wobbled beneath him as Bruno took the first step forward, slow and deliberate. Each step checked for ice, each pause allowing the boy to catch up. The trail Bruno followed was not easy. But it was familiar. He remembered this place. Faint scents, wood smoke, iron, the salt of old stew, tippled his senses. Buried in the thoughts of memory, there was a cabin. He didn't know if it still stood, or if anyone still waited inside. But it was the only direction he had. And it was better than staying here to die in the cold. The child stumbled more than he walked. Soft boots weren't enough against the icy terrain. His movements were clumsy, every few steps bringing him down to his knees. But Bruno waited. Nudged. Encouraged. They moved like this, inch by inch, under the deepening gray of the sky. At one point, the boy collapsed completely, his little face screwed tight with fatigue. He sat down in the snow, lips pale, eyes nearly closing. His entire body shivered. Bruno turned back. He searched the snow and found the rabbit. Carried it gently in his jaws and placed it in the boy's lap. Then, curling beside him once again, he gave the child a few minutes of warmth. A moment of stillness. The boy clung to the rabbit. Then, slowly, pushed himself back up. Bruno rose with him. They continued. Half step by half step, child and dog moved deeper into the woods. And then, just as the wind picked up again, Bruno saw it. A thin ribbon of smoke curling above a break in the trees. Then, the cabin. The log walls sat low, nestled among snow-laden pine. Faded green shutters hung crooked on either side of a frost-glazed window. The chimney exhaled weakly, like a tired breath. But it was warm. Alive. And it was close. Inside, Frank Dillard stirred stew in a dented iron pot hung above a flickering hearth. He moved slow, like a man unfamiliar with his limbs, like each step required intention. 67 years old. His shoulders were still broad, but his back had begun to bow. His once black hair had retreated to the edges of his temples, now gray and thin. A rough beard covered his chin, and his eyes, pale blue, had long ago stopped expecting visitors. This cabin had once been filled with laughter. His wife's, his son's. Before the crash on I-81 that took them both, Frank had come here to finish grieving. To disappear. To let the world move on while he stood still. The cabin was quiet. The woods were constant. Nothing asked for words anymore. Until a sound reached his ears. Something sharp. Not the wind. Not an animal. A knock. A cry. Then, a scratch. At the door. Frank froze. He put down the ladle, crossed the cabin in 3 deliberate steps, and unlatched the door. There, fanged by falling snow and fading light, stood a golden retriever. Muzzle dusted with white, eyes deep and steady. And leaning against his thick frame. A child. Tiny. Barely upright. Frank's eyes widened. He reached out instinctively, ushering them inside with trembling hands. He didn't question it. Didn't ask how or why or what. He just knew. This was no coincidence. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. What in the? He shut the door hard behind them. Snow howled outside, but inside, warmth returned. Frank laid the boy on the old couch, grabbed a wool blanket from the weapon, and wrapped him up tight. The child didn't speak. Didn't resist. He was beyond exhaustion. Frank moved quickly, filling a mug with warm water. He added a splash of salt and honey, dipped a rag, and gently wiped the child's face. The dog sat silently near the hearth, steam rising from his back. Frank noticed how his eyes never left the boy. Never once. That night, Frank lit his pipe. For the first time in 10 years, he felt something shift. A quiet click in his chest. Like a door locked long ago was being tried again, tested, not yet open, but no longer ignored. Outside, snow still fell. But in the cabin, the fire crackled. Steady, Sure. And under that roof slept 3 souls. One old man, one older dog, and one child barely big enough to walk. Not a family by blood, but drawn together by something deeper. By need. Morning came slowly. Not with sunlight, but a dull gray smear across the sky, like someone had laid a wet sheet over the world. The forest was still, heavy with snow and silence. Inside the cabin, it was warmer. Not just from the fire, but from presence. From life. Frank had barely slept. He sat at the table, his large hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't sipped it. He just held it. Watching. The boy slept on the couch, cocooned in the wool blanket. His little body curled tight, one hand clinging to the stuffed rabbit now dry and ruined beneath his chin. His breathing was light and even, the kind of breath that only comes when a body knows, somewhere deep, it's safe. Bruno sat upright in front of the hearth. Still. Watchful. As if guarding both the child and the fire. Frank studied the dog. His coat, once golden, was now muted by age and time. Scars. A slight limp. An eye that didn't follow movement quite right. But there was a quiet dignity to him. A steadiness. A knowing. He wasn't just some old stray. He had served. Protected. Been loved. And now, somehow, he'd saved a life. Frank set the mug down and stood slowly. His knees cracked as he moved, and the dog's ears twitched. But Bruno didn't get up. Just watched. Frank approached the couch with the caution of someone handling something fragile. "Morning, kiddo," he said quietly. The boy didn't answer. His eyes fluttered open slowly, blinking against the soft light. He looked up at Frank's weathered face, studying the deep lines around his mouth, the bushy brows that hung heavy above pale, tired eyes. Then his gaze shifted. To the bowl in Frank's hand. I got some food," Frank said, crouching. "Not much. But better than ice." Still, no reply. The boy's small arms pulled the blanket closer around him. Frank placed the bowl down and reached for a spoon, then paused. "You got a name, kid?" The child blinked. One hand gripped the rabbit tighter. Frank sighed and stood up. "That's all right," he muttered. "I used to know some quiet ones too." He walked to the corner where an old wooden chest sat beneath a window. It was covered in dust. Forgotten. The latch creaked when he opened it. Inside were blankets, a few old stuffed animals, some dusty board books, things that once belonged to his son. Things he hadn't touched in years. He brought them out slowly. One by one. Laid them on the rug near the boy without saying a word. A faded fire truck. A cloth picture book with soft pages. A teddy bear missing one eye. None of it was new. None of it even clean. But the boy didn't shrink away. He just watched. Quietly. Frank scratched his chin. "You're a quiet one," he murmured. "That's all right. We've got time." He turned and moved to the woodpile near the stove, beginning to stack logs into the firebox. As he did, he felt something shift behind him. Footsteps. Small. Soft. He turned and saw the boy, bundled again in the oversized snowsuit, standing in the middle of the room. Mittens dragging at his sides. Rabbit tucked under one arm. Bruno walked beside him. Ever vigilant. Frank looked at them for a long moment. "You can't stay out here long, not dressed like that," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. The boy didn't answer. Didn't nod. Didn't try. Just looked up at Frank. Quietly. Trustingly. Frank let out a breath. "All right, then. You win. He scooped the child into his arms, surprised again by how light he was, and carried him outside. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped into the woodshed, Bruno following close behind. There, Frank chopped more logs. He didn't speak. Neither did the boy. But something formed in that silence. Not words, not yet, but something like a connection. Later that afternoon, Frank stood by the window, arms crossed. He looked out toward the forest. He hadn't called anyone. Hadn't picked up the old radio, or driven down to the ranger station to find the sheriff. Not yet. Because he knew what might happen. The boy could be taken. Placed in a foster system. Lost again in the shuffle of bureaucracy and strangers. And the dog? Probably picked up by animal control. Put in a shelter. Or worse. No. Not yet. Not until he knew more. Behind him, a sound. Soft. A voice. Barely a whisper. Frank turned. The boy stood on the rug, holding one of the wooden alphabet blocks in his small hands. He pointed at it. Then pointed to himself. Lee, he whispered. Frank blinked. Eli, he asked. The boy nodded slowly. Frank felt something tighten in his chest. That's your name? Eli nodded again. Then turned and sat down on the rug, content with having shared that much. Frank nodded too. Eli, he repeated softly. All right. He bent to pick up a split log, then looked out again. Past the tree line. The sky beyond was darker than before, low, turning clouds rolling in fast. Not just snow anymore. This was a storm. Winter's voice rising in anger. He muttered to himself, better get inside. Eli was already bundled in the wool coat Frank had patched up earlier. The sleeves were too long, but the boy didn't seem to mind. Bruno lay beside him on the front step, tail brushing the wooden porch. The boy hummed quietly, some song only he knew. He reached again for Bruno's neck like he had done before, steadying himself with the dog's thick fur. The golden retriever rose, slow but sure, allowing Eli to lean into him. Together, they stepped into the cabin just as the first gust of wind shook the trees. Inside, Frank stirred the fire higher. Filled the kettle. The windows dimmed early, the light outside swallowed by thick storm clouds. Soon sleep began to tap against the windows, then beat harder. A steady rhythm of ice and wind. Eli sat cross-legged by the fireplace, trying to match puzzle pieces from an old wooden set. When he completed a piece, he looked up at Frank with shy pride, like he'd done something grand. Frank smiled, a slow, genuine smile that creased his face in a way it hadn't in years. You're a clever one, Eli, he said. Smarter than me, I bet. That night, the power went out. The wind screamed down the valley like a ghost let loose. It rattled windows. Groaned through the chimney. The cabin moaned with the weight of the storm. Frank lit an old oil lamp and pulled Eli into his lap with the blanket wrapped tight. Bruno lay curled at their feet, ears twitching. Lightning flashed. Thunder cracked. Eli jumped, burying his face into Frank's chest. Frank held him steady. Wrapped both arms around the small, shaking body. It's just noise, he whispered into the boy's curls. Just wind. We're safe here. Outside, the storm raged. But in the cabin, three souls sat close, bound by something neither of them could name. Safety. Warmth. And the beginning of something new. The storm didn't let up until well past sunrise. By then, everything outside was blanketed in a fresh, heavy layer of snow. Thick icicles hung like crystal teeth from the roof's edge, and drifts had piled high against the cabin walls. Frank stepped outside briefly that morning, Bruno at his side, crunching through the knee-deep snow to survey the damage. It wasn't good. A large pine had split in two near the bend in the trail, its top half fallen directly across the narrow road that led to town. A second tree leaned precariously over the power line, which now sagged in the middle like a frayed clothesline pulled too tight. Frank rubbed his beard and muttered, "No driving out. Not for a while." He looked down at Bruno, who simply watched the woods with alert eyes, ears twitching at every small sound. When they returned inside, the air felt different. Still quiet, but not empty. Eli had woken and was sitting on the floor by the fire, stacking blocks again. His curls were messy, his cheeks rosy with leftover sleep. He looked up as they entered, then down again without a word, comforted by the presence of the dog who had brought him in. Frank pulled off his gloves and coat, then stirred the stew pot, now simmering low on the stove. "We'll be here a bit longer," he said aloud, not to anyone in particular. "Better get comfortable." He ladled some of the stew into a small bowl and placed it in front of Eli. The boy didn't hesitate. He picked up the spoon and ate with quiet hunger, like someone who knew how to be careful with food. Bruno lay nearby, content to just be close. After breakfast, Frank retrieved a dusty metal trunk from under his bed. Inside were things he hadn't touched in years. Memories, mostly. He sat at the kitchen table and lifted the lid gently, like unsealing a tomb. Faded photographs, hand-drawn birthday cards, a stack of unopened mail. At the very bottom, tucked inside a yellowing manila folder, was a drawing. A stick figure family, 2 adults, 1 small boy, and beside the boy, a dog with an oversized head and crooked smile. Above it, in uneven letters, Daniel. Frank swallowed hard. That had been his son's name. He set the drawing aside, blinked against the sting in his eyes, and reached deeper into the folder. Emergency contact numbers. A fire station roster from over a decade ago. And then, among them, a photograph. It was Frank, young, sturdy, kneeling beside a proud, bright-eyed golden retriever in a service vest. Bruno. Frank let out a slow breath, rubbing the edge of the photo with his thumb. "So it really is you," he whispered. The dog, resting on the braided rug near the fireplace, lifted his head slightly at the sound of his name. His tail thumped once, then rested again. Outside, the snow had started to melt in places, trickling off eaves and branches in jagged rivulets. But the world remained mostly silent, as if nature were still holding its breath. And then, footsteps. Not paws. Boots. Crunching across the crusted snow. Steady. Heavy. Frank stood slowly, glancing through the front window. Someone was coming. A man, tall and broad, with a tan beanie pulled low over his ears and a canvas backpack slung across his shoulder. He moved like someone who'd been walking a long time. Not hurried, but determined. Frank reached for the rifle mounted above the door, not with the intent to use it, but to show he wasn't unarmed. Bruno stood beside him, calm and alert. The man came to a stop a few yards from the porch. "Morning," he called out, voice hoarse but steady. Frank didn't answer immediately. Behind him, he heard the door creak open. Eli. Barefoot in the doorway, rabbit in hand, curls tousled from a nap. The man's eyes locked on the boy, and he froze. Frank turned slightly, saw Eli standing there, wide-eyed and uncertain. Bruno brushed against the boy's side protectively. Eli stepped back, half shielded by the dog. The man exhaled sharply and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a photo, creased and worn, and held it up. "That's him," he said softly. Frank's fingers tightened around the rifle. Not threateningly, but thoughtfully. He turned to Eli and gently ushered him back inside. Then, without a word, he motioned for the man to follow. Inside, the man shed his snowy coat and sat at the table. Frank didn't offer him coffee. Didn't offer his name. The boy sat cross-legged by the fire again, Bruno curled beside him like a golden blanket. The stranger watched them quietly for a moment, then spoke. "You found him?" Frank nodded. "He found me." The man's name was Philip. A social worker, of sorts. Emergency placement and child recovery specialist. He'd been working with state services for years. But this case, this one was different. The boy had been reported missing, but with almost no useful information. No father on record. The mother had vanished shortly after the police questioned him. No known relatives. No birth certificate. No medical records that anyone could find. Only a name. Eli. "We got lucky," Caleb said. "Someone recognized her vehicle near the mountain trails." Put two and two together. Frank said nothing. Caleb looked over at the child again. "He doesn't say much. Just his name." Frank nodded slowly. "He doesn't need to say anything. He's safe." Silence settled again. Then Caleb shifted in his seat. "I'll need to bring him back." Frank's eyes darkened slightly. "To what?" "We've got folks. Nurses. Social workers. It's not a perfect system, but he'll be taken care of." Frank didn't look at him. His gaze rested on the boy, who was now gently brushing Bruno's ear with his mittened hand. "He is taken care of," Frank said quietly. Caleb met his eyes. "I can tell. But there are things that need to be done. Paperwork. Placement. Custody hearings. It all takes time." Frank's shoulders softened, just a bit. "I'll be back in 2 days," Caleb continued. "With someone official. Someone who knows what questions to ask." Frank walked into the edge of the tree line. Before he left, Caleb turned back toward the dog. "He's something else," he said. Frank looked at Bruno. "He's the reason that boy's still alive." Caleb nodded. And disappeared into the snow. Frank stood for a long time before heading back inside. Eli had fallen asleep again, curled on the rug near the fire. Bruno, ever faithful, never left his side. The land outside the cabin seemed to breathe for the first time in weeks. But inside, a heaviness settled in Frank's chest, a quiet knowing that something precious now stood at the edge of things. And it would not be easy to let go. Frank stood in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee that he hadn't touched. The warmth from it seeped into his palms, but his thoughts were far from the cabin's heat. Across the room, Eli still slept. He was tangled in the wool blanket, his stuffed rabbit tucked tight under his chin. His little legs curled up, and his breathing came in soft, shallow puffs. Bruno lay a few feet away, alert even in rest, eyes half closed but ears twitching at every small creak of the cabin. Frank looked down into the black swirl of the coffee and felt the weight of it all. Not just the boy. Or the dog. But the past. The silence. The possibility that he might have to hand them over. He walked slowly to the table, sat down, and exhaled long and low. The air felt heavier than usual. Not with smoke or dust, but with decision. He could still say no. Could still let Caleb come back with his clipboard and leave with no signatures. But would that be fair? To Eli? To Bruno? To himself? He wasn't sure anymore. An hour passed. Then another. When Eli finally stirred, he did so quietly. Rubbing one eye with a mittened hand, he padded across the floor and stopped in front of Frank. "Hungry?" Frank asked. The boy nodded. Frank smiled, small, tired, but real. He knelt beside the stove and stirred a pot of oatmeal, adding honey the way his wife used to. Slow, thoughtful circles. He ladled a portion into a small bowl and brought it over to the boy, who climbed into the rocker with surprising ease. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fire crackled gently. The morning light pushed faintly through the frost-laced windows. And the only sounds in the room were the scrape of spoon against bowl and the soft huff of Bruno's grieving. It wasn't until late morning that something finally broke the stillness. Tires on gravel. Frank stood slowly, his body tightening. Bruno rose, ears perked. He padded to the window and stared out into the pale haze beyond the trees. Frank joined him, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. A county vehicle. White. Plain. Parked awkwardly at the bend in the path. A woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, dressed in layers of forest green wool, clipboard in one hand and a small canvas bag in the other. Her face was kind but cautious. Behind her came Caleb, this time without the pack but with the same steady gait. Frank opened the door before they could knock. He didn't speak. The woman offered a soft smile. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said gently, looking past Frank's shoulder. "My name is Mara. Do you remember me?" Eli stood in the middle of the room, gripping his rabbit like a lifeline. He blinked at her, unsure. Then slowly shook his head. "That's okay," she said with another smile. "I brought some toys if you want to see." Eli didn't respond. Bruno let out a low breath, his body still rigid. Frank stepped to the side and folded his arms. Mama glanced at him. "Mr. Dillard, I need to ask. Has the boy said anything about his family? Anything at all?" "Only his name." She nodded and made a small note on her clipboard. "He's bonded with the dog," she said, glancing toward Bruno. "You could say that," Frank replied. Caleb stepped forward, voice low. "Frank, if you're willing to file for emergency kin-like placement, we can start paperwork now. It would buy time. Let the boy stay here, for now." Frank looked at them, then at Eli. The boy had wandered closer to Bruno again, kneeling beside him, one hand on his back. His curls glowed in the firelight, and he looked up at Frank with quiet expectation. Frank's voice came rough, but steady. "What do I need to sign?" 3 weeks later, the cabin looked different. Not by much, but enough. The windows were clean. A second pair of boots, tiny, snow-stuffed, sat beside Frank's by the door. The firewood was stacked higher. A new box of crayons lay open on the table beside a folded drawing of a sun and 3 stick figures, a boy, a man, and a dog with lurid ears. A photo of Bruno now rested on the mantel. Not framed, but placed there with care. There was no legal certificate of guardianship yet. The process was slow, and Mara reminded Frank weekly about hearings, assessments, and interviews. But what mattered most wasn't what the government called it. What mattered was now. Eli was safe. Smiling. Alive. Sometimes still silent, but not lost. He turned toward the porch where the wind blew gently through the trees and waved. Frank stood at the window, watching him. His heart, still scarred, still broken in places, was fuller than it had been in years. Not healed. Not perfect. But full. Inside the cabin, the wind soughing, his wife's favorite, rattled softly, stirring for the first time in more than a decade. And the old cabin, like the man within it, breathed again. Sometimes, miracles don't come with trumpets or thunder. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Wrapped in wool. Clutching a rabbit. Guided by an old dog who still remembers what love is. The winter held on longer than usual that year. Snow came again in bursts, and the sun hid behind heavy clouds for days at a time. But inside the cabin, warmth bloomed. Not just from firewood. From routine. From rhythm. Eli fell into it without question, without needing instructions. He would rise with the first glow of morning, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, his curls flattened against one cheek. Frank would already be at the stove, stirring oats, or frying eggs in the cast iron skillet, the same way he used to for his wife, long ago. Bruno was always there, too. First to the door. First to the window. First to curl his body around Eli's when the boy got cold or overwhelmed or simply needed the wordless safety only a dog can give. Frank watched it all unfold with quiet wonder. He'd lived so long in silence, in absence. And now, without fanfare, there was life here again. The small sounds of it, the clink of spoons, the thump of tiny boots on floorboards, the scribble of crayon on scrap paper. And laughter. Eli didn't talk much. Not full sentences. But he giggled. A lot. He'd sit on the rug with Bruno, stacking wood blocks into towers just to knock them over. He'd chase his own shadow across the floor when the firelight danced. Sometimes he'd hum little tunes, fragments of lullabies or songs he couldn't quite remember. But always, Bruno was near. Never more than a few feet away. One day, after a heavy snowfall, Frank took Eli outside. The boy hesitated at first, bundled up like a tiny astronaut in a patched snowsuit and mittens 3 sizes too big. But when Bruno bounded ahead, kicking up white powder and wagging his tail, Eli's feet followed without fear. They walked the trail slowly, Frank's boots crunching a steady path while Eli clung to Bruno's thick fur like a towline. The world was white and silent, the kind of quiet that made everything feel holy. Used to walk this trail with my son, Frank said, mostly to himself. He'd bring that same rabbit with him, too. Swore it was magic. Eli didn't respond, but he looked up at Frank with those wide brown eyes, soft and searching. Frank smiled faintly. Guess he was right. That night, after Eli had fallen asleep with one hand resting on Bruno's flank, Frank lit his pipe and stepped out onto the porch. The stars were clear for once, thousands of them scattered like frost on black velvet. He sat on the rocker his wife used to love and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl into the cold. The weight in his chest hadn't disappeared. But something had shifted. And that shift, subtle, sacred, was enough to keep going. It was a week later, on a gray Sunday morning, when the letter arrived. A plain envelope slipped under the door. No return address. Inside was a single sheet, folded cleanly. Frank opened it carefully, sitting at the table with Eli drawing beside him. Bruno sprawled on the floor. The handwriting was tight, neat. Mr. Dillard. You don't know me, but I know who you are. I'm Eli's mother. Frank stopped reading. His heart skipped once, then thudded heavily. Eli had stopped scribbling. He wasn't looking at Frank, but the way his body stilled said enough. Frank continued. I saw the news. The reports. I saw your name mentioned once in a photo caption. I knew where you were. You don't have to understand me. You don't have to forgive me. But I need you to know that I didn't leave him because I didn't live him. I left him because I was drowning. Because I thought someone else might save him better than I could. I was right. I won't come for him. Not now. Maybe not ever. But thank you. Thank you for giving him what I never could. His name isn't Eli. It's Elijah. I called him that after my grandfather. Keep him safe. If he calls you Dad someday, please let it be true. Frank read the letter twice. Then again. The cabin was silent but humming with tension. Eli was still sitting at the table, quietly staring at his rabbit. Frank folded the letter gently and placed it back in the envelope. Then he stood. Walked to the fireplace. Tossed the letter in. The paper flared up, curling black at the edges before turning to ash. Eli looked up. Frank knelt beside him. Is Elijah okay with you? He asked softly. Eli considered for a second. Then nodded. Frank ruffled the boy's hand, stood, and went back to making lunch. That afternoon, the snow stopped falling. The clouds parted just enough for sunlight to slant through the windows, golden and soft. Eli ran small laps around the room, a blanket tied like a tape, pretending to fly. Bruno followed, tail swishing like a slow metronome, indulging every make-believe adventure. At one point, Eli climbed onto the couch and stretched his arms toward Frank. "Fly?" he asked, grinning. It was only one word. But it was something. Frank lifted him into the air with a chuckle. "All right, Captain Elijah. You're cleared for takeoff." The boy laughed, a dull, ringing laugh. Bruno barked once, joyfully. And in that moment, the cabin was not just full. It was alive. Outside, winter lingered. But inside, a fire burned steadily. Hope flickered against the walls like light through stained glass. And 3 souls, an old man, a small boy, and a faithful dog, shared a peace forged in snow, silence, and second chances. The following week arrived with a strange stillness, like the land was listening. Mornings came quietly, sun barely cresting over the Blue Ridge peaks. The snow was beginning to melt in places now, slinking off pine boughs and trickling from the eaves. Patches of muddy earth peeked through near the river Thrian, and the wind began to smell less like frost and more like rain. Inside the cabin, change came just as subtly. Eli now followed Frank everywhere. He wasn't clinging, not in a fearful way, but watchful, thoughtful. He helped stack firewood, though the logs were twice the size of his mittens. He stirred pots with exaggerated concentration, eyes barely peeping over the rim of the pan. And every afternoon, he brought books from the corner trunk to Frank's chin, curling up against his side as they read slowly, word by word. Bruno was never thawed, always keeping a lazy but protective watch. The dog had grown thinner with the weeks, but not weaker. Something in him had found purpose again. Frank noticed that every time Bruno moved to Eli's side the moment the boy stirred in sleep. Or how he barked, not fiercely, but sharply, at any rustle near the tree line. He didn't let the boy wander more than a few steps without supervision. Old instincts never truly died. Frank couldn't help but think about how Bruno had once saved lives in fires and disaster zones. He hadn't lost that heart. Just hadn't been given a reason to use it in years, until now. One morning, after eggs and warm milk, Frank sat across from Eli and studied the boy quietly. "You ever miss the city?" he asked. Eli looked up, then tilted his head. "What's city?" Frank chuckled. "Never mind." He'd forgotten. This little one barely remembered sidewalks, let alone skyscrapers. All he seemed to know now were pines and fireplaces, Bruno and blueberry jam. That same day, Frank pulled down an old box from the attic. It had his son's name scrawled on the side, Daniel, and inside were toys, photos, books, and one tiny pair of red rain boots. Still caked in dried mud. He sat on the edge of the bed and held them in his hands for a long time. Then he placed them carefully by the door, next to Eli's snow-crusted ones. That night, as they sat by the fire, Frank caught Eli tracing circles in the soot with one finger. Bruno lay beside him, nose tucked beneath a pillow. The room was warm, but quiet in a way that left room for unspoken thoughts. "Eli," Frank said suddenly. The boy looked up. "I'm not much for talking," Frank said. "Never have been. But I reckon, if you ever want to ask me something, anything, you can." Eli just blinked. Then he crawled over, leaned against Frank's knee, and said softly, "You're my grandpa." Frank froze. The words were so quiet, so tentative, that they felt like smoke. Fragile. He looked down, surprised, then nodded slowly. "If that's what you want," he murmured, voice rough with emotion, "then you can. I'll be whatever you need." Eli didn't say anything more. But his tiny hand slipped into Frank's. And stayed there. 2 days later, the world turned again. A knock came at the door, not loud, not urgent, but sure. Bruno growled softly and stood first, tail low, body alert. Frank followed and opened the door. Mara stood there, clipboard under one arm, bundled in a thick coat. Her cheeks were red from wind, but her expression was calm. "Mr. Dillard," she said. "Mind if I come in?" Frank nodded and stepped aside. Eli was sitting near the hearth, coloring a picture of what looked like a big yellow dog in a house with smoke coming from the chimney. He glanced up, then turned back to his drawing, unbothered. Mara sat at the table and pulled out a small file. "There's been some progress," she said. "Some good, some complicated." Frank waited. "We've had no further contact from the mother," she said. "She's untraceable again." Frank's face didn't change. "She won't be back." Mara nodded slowly. "We think the same. And legally, that opens up certain options. If you're still interested in pursuing full custody, we can start the next stage. Permanency planning, home study, background checks." Frank leaned back in his chair. "I've already raised one boy. I ain't fancy. Don't have much to offer except this roof, hot meals, and a good dog." "That might be more than most," Mara said gently. She paused. "We'll need to send someone out for an official evaluation." "Send whoever you want," Frank replied. "I'm not hiding anything." Mara looked over at Eli. "He's made real progress here," she said. "He talks more now. Makes eye contact. Shows emotional connection." "Yeah," Frank said, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. "He's a quiet one, but not a ghost anymore." Mara reached into her bag and handed him a thin packet. "Read this when you can. It outlines the legal steps ahead." "And Frank." He looked up. "Don't underestimate the power of what you've done. Most men wouldn't have answered the door, let alone opened their heart." Frank didn't respond. Just gave a soft grunt and looked down at the file in his hands. Before Mara left, she turned back at the doorway. "You might want to consider a new name on the papers. Elijah Dillard has a nice sound to it." Frank looked over at the boy still sitting near the fire. And nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "It does." That evening, Eli fell asleep early, curled beneath the quilt with Bruno tucked around him like a living shield. Frank stayed up, reading the documents, filling in a few of the blanks, and staring at the line where they asked for his relationship to the child. He paused. Then, slowly, in firm block letters, he wrote, "Guardian. Father. Forever home." He set the pen down and let the quiet settle back in. Spring did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a whisper across the thawing forest floor. The icicles disappeared from the eaves. The snow softened into slush, and muddy footprints began to trail inside the cabin after each trip out. Birds returned one by one, singing like they were tuning instruments for the season ahead. Inside, life blossomed in its own quiet way. Eli, now more often called Elijah, was growing. He talked more. Not long conversations, not yet, but clear, careful sentences. He counted firewood logs with Frank and could name all the animals Bruno had taught him to recognize by scent and sound: deer, rabbit, squirrel, fox. He had a soft spot for the deer, called them soft noses. His bond with Bruno was unshakable. The dog was aging faster now, it seemed. His movements stiffened, his sleep heavier. But his presence never waned. If Elijah moved, Bruno moved. If the boy cried, Bruno pressed his nose gently to Elijah's hand. They were tethered in a way that neither Frank nor any professional could ever explain. The state had sent a caseworker. She came with her clipboard, her forced smiles, and her camera phone. She had inspected the cabin, asked about meals and education, leafed through Frank's old fire department records. She'd even offered to help enroll Elijah in a school down in town when the time came. Before she left, she crouched down beside Elijah, who was stacking rocks in a pile on the porch with great focus. "You like it here?" she asked, gently. The boy looked up at her, then at Bruno, then at Frank, and nodded. She smiled, tucked her papers back in her bag, and said, "We'll be in touch." Frank watched her go, arms crossed. He didn't say much. But that night, he pulled out the old wooden box from his storage trunk and began sorting through papers that hadn't been touched in over a decade: birth certificates, marriage licenses, the deed to the cabin, a blurry photo of him and his wife taken on their wedding day. He paused over that one longer than the rest. "I think you'd like him," he whispered to the picture. "He's got your eyes when he's thinking hard. Real serious like." Bruno, resting by the hearth, let out a soft chuff in agreement. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Frank was chopping kindling near the woodshed when Elijah came running, full sprint, cheeks red, curls bouncing, rabbit clutched tightly in one arm. "Frank," he cried. It was the first time the boy had called his name. Frank dropped the axe instantly and turned, panic flashing through him until he saw the boy's smile, huge, wide, unafraid. "There's Dean." "Too." Elijah pointed toward the river trail. They drank the water. Frank knelt down, heart still pounding, and laughed, a short, breathless thing. "You scared me half to death," he muttered, ruffling the boy's curls. "Next time, yell after you're in sight." "But you came fast." Elijah beamed. "Like Bruno." Bruno trotted up behind him then, tail wagging, breath steady. The boy leaned into the dog, and for a moment, they stood there together, three lives once frayed and floating, now bound tight. It was on one of those warmer evenings, when the sky turned peach and the trees cast long shadows, that Frank found something in the mail he hadn't expected. A sealed envelope from the county clerk. He opened it at the kitchen table while Elijah colored beside him, tongue sticking out the corner of his mouth in concentration. Inside was a single certificate, heavy cream paper, embossed in gold along the edges. At the top, order of legal guardianship. And beneath it, name of guardian, Franklin Dillard. Name of child, Elijah Dillard. Effective immediately. Frank stared at it a long time. It didn't change anything, not in the way they lived, not in the rhythm they built. But somehow, it made it all feel more real. More permanent. More right. He handed the paper to Elijah without a word. The boy didn't understand the formality of it, but he looked at the bold letters and the bold seal and gasped like it was treasure. "Is it mine?" Frank nodded. "It's yours. All of it." Elijah pressed the paper flat and smiled so wide Frank thought his chest might crack open. Then he ran to Bruno, waving it. "Look, we're a family." Bruno barked once, then gently licked Elijah's hand. It was settled. That night, Frank lit a candle at the mantel. It was a quiet thing, the flame small and flickering. He didn't say any prayer aloud. He just stood there, eyes closed, remembering. His wife. His son. The long quiet years in between. And now, this boy, this dog, this strange second chance. "Elijah's gonna be okay," he whispered. And somehow, he knew she heard. Later, as the boy slept curled up beside Bruno and the fire burned low, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and opened a fresh journal. He hadn't written in years. Not since Daniel died. But tonight, he wrote. Page 1, how we found each other. And he wrote about the try in the forest. The old dog who answered it. The boy left behind. The choice to open the door. The choice to stay. Summer slipped quietly into the mountains. Not with fireworks or heat waves like in the city, but with softer days, long stretches of warm light filtered through high pines and the sweet scent of wildflowers blooming near the river. The snow had long since melted, and in its place came green, bright mosses, budding shrubs, the wild sprouting of ferns underfoot. Elijah thrived in it. He ran barefoot across the clearing now, rabbit in one hand, a stick in the other, declaring battles with imaginary dragons and knights. His legs had grown stronger. His voice louder. He laughed freely, without glancing over his shoulder. And always, without fail, Bruno followed. The old golden retriever had grown slower, his steps now more deliberate, and sometimes after playing, he'd need to lie down and rest longer than usual. But his eyes remained bright. Every tail wag, every soft nuzzle of Elijah's face, still carried the spark that had drawn him out of the forest that day when everything began. Frank watched them both with the wary awe of a man who knew how fast joy could be taken. But now, he allowed himself to live in it more. He no longer sat with his arms crossed. No longer waited for silence to reclaim the cabin. He played cards with Elijah on rainy afternoons and read aloud by firelight in the evenings. He made pancakes shaped like dogs. He taught the boy how to bait a fishing hook. And sometimes, just sometimes, he found himself laughing too. The kind of laugh that had dust on it. The kind that hadn't come out in a decade. One afternoon, Frank was sweeping the porch when he spotted something on the edge of the tree line. A shape. Someone walking. He tensed slightly, his hand resting instinctively on the rake handle, but then relaxed when he saw it was Caleb. The social worker. His coat was off, sleeves rolled, and a small backpack hung over one shoulder. Frank met him halfway. "No papers this time?" Frank asked, voice dry but not unkind. Caleb grinned. "Nope. Just checking in." Frank led him back toward the porch where Elijah was sitting cross-legged with Bruno, threading beads onto a string. When the boy saw Caleb, he blinked, then smiled softly. "Hi." Caleb gave a small wave. "Hey, champ." Elijah held up his bead string. "It's for Bruno." Bruno thumped his tail proudly. Caleb sat on the porch steps beside Frank and watched for a moment. "He seems good." Frank nodded. "He is." There was a pause. Then Caleb said quietly, "You know, I wasn't sure at first. About this whole thing. A widower alone in the woods with no formal training, no plan." Frank didn't look at him. "Me neither." But, Caleb added, glancing at Elijah now laying his head gently on Bruno's side, This is working. Better than most." Frank finally turned his head. "We ain't perfect." "No one is," Caleb said. "But you live him. And he knows it." Frank didn't respond. He just watched Elijah gently slip the beaded string around Bruno's thick neck. That night, Frank lit the fire early. The summer days were warm, but the evenings still carried a bite in the mountains. He stood by the window, staring out as fireflies danced just beyond the tree line. Elijah was asleep on the couch, Bruno's head resting on the boy's hip. Frank watched them both, then turned and quietly stepped out onto the porch. He didn't often pray out loud. But tonight, he did. "God," he said softly into the dark, "thank you for sending him. For sending them both." He paused, breath catching just a little. "I thought I was done. I thought you were finished with me. But you weren't." Inside, the fire popped softly. A breeze lifted the tines. And in that quiet, Frank felt something shift again. Not a grand, earth-shaking movement, just the gentle settling of a heart into a place it was always meant to be. The next morning brought an unexpected change. Bruno didn't rise at first. He was lying on his side, breathing steady but slow, his tail thudding once when Elijah stirred beside him. Frank knew the look. He'd seen it in the station back when old firehouse dogs had grown tight. Bruno was fading. Not sick. Not in pain. Just ready. Elijah sensed it too. He crawled close to Bruno, whispering things no one else could hear. Stories. Thanks. Promises. Frank sat nearby, silent, a lump forming in his throat he hadn't felt since the accident that took his own boy. And then, sometime near midday, Bruno lifted his head one last time. Looked at Elijah. Then at Frank. Then let out a long, soft breath. And was gone. The cabin was quiet that afternoon. Not empty. Just reverent. Frank dug a place beneath the tallest pine in the yard. Elijah helped, carrying handfuls of wildflowers and tucking them into the earth. They placed Bruno's rabbit bead collar on a stone. And they sat there a long time. No words. Only love. Only memory. That night, Elijah climbed into Frank's lap near the fire. The silence between them was thick but warm. Then the boy looked up and asked, "Do dogs go to heaven?" Frank cleared his throat. "If any do," he said, "Bruno's already waiting by the gate." Elijah smiled faintly, wiping his nose. "I hope he saved a spot for me." Frank pulled the boy close and whispered, "He saved this one for you first." The weeks that followed were quiet, but never empty. Without Bruno padding across the floorboards, the cabin felt slightly different, lighter in sound, but heavier in memory. His food bowl remained untouched for a few days, as if the boy couldn't quite accept its emptiness. The old bed beside the hearth was left alone, the blankets still dented from where Bruno had last rested. Elijah didn't cry every day. But sometimes at night, when the fire died low and the wind stirred outside, Frank would feel a small body press up against him a little tighter in bed. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Grief had a way of settling like snow, quietly, blanketing everything, but eventually giving way to new life beneath. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the porch, Elijah came outside holding something behind his back. Frank was chopping wood. He looked up as the boy approached. "I made something," Elijah said. He pulled out a drawing, crayon on rough brown paper. A house, a man, a boy, and a dog with a big yellow coat and a crooked tail. Above it, in huge, slightly wobbly letters, "My family." Frank's throat tightened. He reached down and pulled Elijah close, holding him tight. "That's just about perfect," he said. Elijah beamed. "We should hang it up," he said. "So Bruno can see it." Frank smiled. "He already does." By the end of summer, Elijah had started sleeping in the loft bed Frank had built from scratch. No more naps by the fireplace. No more clutching his rabbit through the night. He still talked about Bruno. But now he told stories. Like the time Bruno found his lost mitten. Or how Bruno knew which sticks were magic. Or how, in his words, Bruno chased away all the bad dreams with his nose. The cabin was beginning to feel more like a home. Frank had fixed the broken shutter. Painted the porch. Rewired the radio so music played again during dinner. He even taught Elijah how to play checkers, though the boy insisted every game was won by Bruno's invisible advice. One crisp evening in early autumn, Mara returned. She arrived with a folder under one arm and a small digital camera around her neck. Elijah greeted her with a wave and led her straight to the drawing on the wall. "That's Bruno," he said proudly. "He was the best dog ever." Mama smiled and knelt beside him. "I think you're right." She looked at Frank. "Can we talk inside?" They stepped into the kitchen while Elijah stayed outside, gathering pine cones. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said, pulling papers from her folder. "The guardianship is final. Permanent. No appeals. He's officially yours now. No one can undo that." Frank nodded slowly, letting the weight of it settle in. Mara hesitated, then added, "There's one more thing." She handed him a sealed envelope. "This came through the system late. It's from her." Frank didn't have to ask who. He stared at the envelope for a long time. Then, quietly, he slipped it into the drawer beside the stove. "I know what it says," he muttered. Mara nodded, respecting the silence. "You're a good man, Frank," she said, standing. Frank didn't respond right away. But then he said, "I wasn't always." Mara gave a small smile. "Maybe not. But you are now. That's what matters." That night, after Elijah had fallen asleep with a book open on his chest and his rabbit under one arm, Frank stepped outside. The stars were bright above the pines. He sat on the porch steps, wrapped in his coat, and pulled out an old photograph from his pocket. One of him, younger, kneeling beside Bruno in his fire vest, both of them grinning like fools. "You did good, old boy," Frank whispered. "You saved him. And you saved me." He closed his eyes. Above him, the wind stirred the tones his wife once loved, their soft notes dancing through the mountain air like a lullaby. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter returned, but this time it didn't feel as cruel. Snow blanketed the forest, but the cabin was full of life. Elijah's laughter echoed off the rafters. New boots stood beside the fire. New books sat on the shelf. And above the mantel, beside Frank's old badge, hung a framed version of Elijah's drawing, his family. One morning, Elijah tugged on Frank's sleeve. "I want to go back," he said. "To where Bruno found me." Frank's eyebrows rose. "You remember that place?" "Just a little," Elijah said. "But I want to say thank you." Frank didn't argue. He packed a thermos of hot cider, wrapped Elijah in 2 scarves, and together they walked the long path through the snow-quiet forest. They stopped at the spot, by the riverbank, near the fallen shed. Elijah stood still for a moment. Then knelt and pressed one mittened hand into the snow. "Thank you," he whispered. The forest held its breath. Then, in the quiet, Frank swore he heard the softest chuff, just once. He looked around, smiling. "Come on," he said gently. "Time to head home." Back at the cabin, Frank poured cider and Elijah sat by the fire, legs swinging, cheeks flushed from cold and joy. The world outside turned white again. But inside? Warmth. Light. Hope. Sometimes God sends his miracles quietly. Not with thunder. Not with angels in the sky. But with a lost cry in the snow, and the faithful heart of an old dog who remembered how to listen. If you believe that no one is ever truly forgotten. If you believe second chances find us when we least expect. Type amen in the comments. Like. Subscribe. And may God bless every heart still waiting to be found.